Welcome to Getting to Grips with Great SEND Governance. We hope that you will find this webinar series really useful. We have no idea what your role is or where you are, so what we've tried to do is make sure that this sort of webinar is relevant to everyone, regardless of where their SEND governance takes place. We do hope that you will engage with us and interact. So the chat will be open throughout. My colleague Nicole Dempsey will be manning the chat, and we will be sort of at the reflection point in each set of the slides. We will sort of just confirm if there are any questions that need answering and try to answer those. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us on a Thursday afternoon, and hopefully you will find this relevant to your role. Hopefully you can all see my second slide, is that right? Wonderful. Okay, so we are actually going to be talking today specifically about governance structures and legislative frameworks. We're very conscious of the fact that that might be a little bit dry, so I will try to add in some sort of relevant anecdotes or sort of information around what we're doing to hopefully keep you all on board and stop people signing out of the conversation. We are here from Nason Whole School SEND, and what you have on the screen in front of you now are the Whole School SEND contract aims. So the contract is held with the Department for Education, and our focus is to ensure that the school workforce really understands their responsibilities in relation to SEND and has the right support to actually meet SEND needs within their schools. You'll notice that throughout the presentation, and indeed in this slide itself, we refer to SEN and SEND. SEN is special educational needs, and SEND is special educational needs and disabilities. And it really depends on whether the language is coming from Nason Whole School SEND, because we tend to talk about SEND, or whether it comes from the DFE, where it's often SEN. So we are talking about the same thing, so please don't be worried that you only know about one or the other, because they are one and the same. So the presenters we have this evening are myself. I'm Angela Holsworth. I am Regional SEND Lead for Lancashire and West Yorkshire, but I'm also, and probably more importantly this evening, the CEO of the Seaview Trust. So we are a multi-academy trust. We have schools with nursery provision, we have primary schools, 2 all through special schools, and a specialist college. So because of that, we span sort of all ages and stages of governance. With me on the call, I have my colleague Nicole Dempsey. She is Deputy Regional Lead for Lancashire and West Yorkshire, a very experienced Senko, and she now has responsibility for SEND across the whole Dixon's Trust. And in addition to that, we have quietly in the background, but there to help with any difficult questions you might want to throw out, Nicola Wilkinson, who is an experienced trust business leader, currently taking responsibility for governance within the Seaview Trust. I promise if there are any questions that come through today that we can't answer, we will sort of take them away, and at the next session we will be sort of giving you the answers to any questions that have been raised. So just to clarify our session objectives for this afternoon, essentially it is to sort of understand those legal responsibilities and governance structures themselves and where responsibility for SEND sits, because I think in the current landscape it can be quite confusing to understand what's whose job. And what we hope is that if we have improved understanding across the workforce and all of those wonderful volunteers who provide governance within the sector, we will have better compliance and ultimately better outcomes for our young people with SEND. I'm going to start with a bit of SEND national data. Don't worry, I'm not a big data head, so it will be presented to you in a way which is very accessible and easy, and essentially is a series of little charts for us to look at, but we're trying to cover that whole range so we have an understanding of what SEND looks like nationally. So if we start with the early years, and this was the most recent information I could find, was 2018 data. So essentially, we have children with SEND obviously identified in the early years, And for these young people, what this chart shows is where they are educated. So at the moment, most of the children who have identified SEND needs will be in maintained nursery schools. That's what MNS stands for. And so therefore, you know, we would expect our maintained nursery schools to have a good understanding of SEND and governors within those structures to understand what they're doing for learners with SEND. Also, we've got children who are in nursery classes, we've got children who are being educated within the voluntary sector, private, and then also children who are with childminders. Okay. If we move into the school and academy data, the information we have here is that children with education, health and care plans are sitting at around 3.7% of the whole population of school-age learners, and children with SEN support are at 12.2%. So if we add those two figures together, we're talking about sort of almost 16% of learners have some form of special educational needs. So that's sort of the remit for why it's really important that as governors you feel confident in what your schools or your settings are doing for children and young people with SEND, because they are a significant minority, and it is important that we have that sort of focus on what is happening for them and an opinion on whether what is happening in your setting is the best it can be. And we're hoping to help you really with that sort of thinking. So if we drill down a little bit into the primary school data, and this is primary school data from maintained schools and academies, and we have a look at the information about the identification of SEND, we can see that the vast majority of children fall in this category C and I. That's communication and interaction needs. So most of the children, almost a half, 41%, have got communication and interaction needs. That's what primary schools are identifying. And all of this data comes from the census that's filled in schools. Then you've got children who have got sensory and physical needs, which is showing as S and P on the chart, 5.6%. We've got social, emotional, mental health coming in at 16.6%, cognition and learning at 28.3%, other at 3.4%, and non-specified at 4.2%. So if we look at primary schools, the three areas where most need has been identified are cognition and learning, communication, interaction, and social, emotional, and mental health. And so thinking about your own schools and your own schools data, there's a question for you to ask yourselves about, you know, is that about right? Is that about where our school's at in terms of who we've identified across those four broad areas of need? And we'll pick up on the four broad areas of need later on in the presentation. The next thing to be thinking about is secondary schools. And what you will hopefully notice as I've moved between those two slides is that the numbers change significantly. So if I just take you back to the first slide and hold the primary data in your heads, and then I flick you forward to the secondary school data, you can see the change. And the big change really is between those areas of communication and interaction and cognition and learning. Now, it's interesting to me because children are on a continuum, they go through their education. We wouldn't necessarily expect to see a big change in the pattern of identification of SEND as children move through their sort of education and learning journey. So what sits behind that? And I think one of the things that it points to is possibly transition data. And how is information passed as children move through the education system? So it's possible that some children whose needs are labelled as one thing in primary are labelled as something different in secondary. And just to further illustrate that point, we'll share with you this chart here where we can see the primary data is in the sort of slightly paler green and the secondary data is in the brighter green. So where the anomalies are really in this identification are very much around specific learning difficulties, social, emotional, mental health needs, speech language communication needs. They're the three where the difference is really obvious. And what we find is secondary schools are quite good at identifying specific learning difficulties, primary schools less so. However, primary schools are very good at identifying sort of speech language communication needs, and then they may be labelled as something else as children move through the system. And there's a slightly higher proportion of children identified with social, emotional and mental health needs within secondary. So thinking about where you are actually exercising your governance role, hopefully this is useful information for you to be thinking about sort of how the pattern of identification is for your school. If we move into the FE sector, there isn't a huge amount of data out there for FE, I have to say. I've searched, but the information that I've found that's readily available really is about the number of learners within the sector who have special educational needs or are described within the sector as learners with learning disabilities or difficulties. So in the 16 to 18 population, that's about 23%. And as we move into the adult population, it's 14%. But overall, 17% of students in colleges have a learning difficulty or disability. So that's not hugely dissimilar to the pattern that we see in our primary and secondary schools. And I'm going to stop now for a minute, partly because I feel like you've listened to me for quite long enough. And I'm just going to put a little bit of a question to you for you to have a little reflection on. If you've got a pad and paper and you want to write it down, that's fine. If you just want to do it in your head, that's fine. If you want to pop something in the chat, equally fine. So what's the identification of pattern for SEND within your setting? And the answer can be, I have no idea, because that's absolutely fine, because we're all starting in different places. And then secondly, how are you holding your leaders to account? So I'm just going to give you a couple of moments to reflect on that. And then I'm just going to ask Nicole if there's anything in the chat we need to know about. If you're writing a thesis, that's absolutely fine. Do continue. But if you've just answered the question with haven't got a clue, you might be ready for us to move on. So I'm just going to go across to Nicole and say, Nicole, is there anything that anybody would like us to think about?
Yeah, there's a few responses, but a definite pattern that is mostly identification through formal assessments and observation. Some difficulty with the observation side of things because of COVID and the restrictions that have been in place. Having staff within the setting that have got the skills to do that identification. Teacher reporting of concerns. So quite a varied spread. Just coming through about holding leaders to account now. Just give me a second. Patterns should be captured in said information reports. Holding to account through regular communication, monitoring visits, curriculum and outcomes committee and learning walks and monitoring visits, meetings. So again, a key theme of monitoring and communication, plus data, of course. I think that's pretty much the pattern and budget spending.
Thank you, Nicole, that's great. Okay, so we're going to move on looking at our next sort of section, which is about governance structures. And forgive me if you're an expert in governance structures, but I thought it was really important that we just refreshed our memory, because we tend to know how the structure works in our own organisations, but there are so many different setups, and as I said earlier, we're not sure who will be joining the call, so we thought we actually share the various different formats of governance and say where SEND responsibility sits, then it's an opportunity for you to understand your own role and also the wider context of SEND governance in other settings. So if we go back to that slide that we saw at the beginning about the early years data, private early years settings are generally proprietor-led. So it is the proprietor's responsibility for SEND. You know, they need to make sure that they are delivering and discharging all the legislative duties that are required of them. And in the Code of Practice, which we'll be talking about later, the key sort of section there is Chapter 5. If we move into voluntary sector provision, so early years voluntary sector provision is often sort of what was previously preschool sort of set up, charitable organisations set up to run education provision for the early years. In a previous life, I was chair of a small nursery, and you know, I know it was very difficult to maintain governance structure because you had a very high churn of staff and also quite a high churn of governors, because people tended to be a governor whilst their child was attending the provision for a couple of years and then they would move on. So keeping that sort of consistency of governance can be really difficult. If we think about SEND governance for nursery classes in maintained schools or academies, and indeed maintained nursery schools, their setup is pretty similar. So when we talk about the schools, I will be including maintained nursery schools within that. And then childminders, and the reason I've included this is I'm not sure how many of you are parents who might be using childminders. I'm not sure, you know, sort of whether anyone on the call is indeed a childminder. So I thought we'd just include them because we want to be fully inclusive. That's what it's all about. And therefore, you know, the fact of the matter is, the childminders must follow the statutory framework for the early years, and they should be identifying SEND. So if a child goes to a childminder before coming to school, the childminder still has that duty to identify special educational needs. And it's really important that childminders do have access to somebody who can provide Senko support. And many sort of local authorities do assist with that, but not all. So it can be difficult for childminders to actually access the support they need for that identification. If we move into maintained mainstream schools, and I've included here federations because the governance structure is very similar. This slide is actually from Maintained School Governance Structures, Roles and Descriptors, snappy title, from the DFE. And essentially, it sort of sets out how it works within a school governing body or a federation governing body. So a federation governing body really means that one governing body is taking on responsibility for a number of schools that are federated formally. You will notice that sitting below the school governing board, there is a sort of committee structure in dashed lines. And then if you look at the key, you can see it's an optional structure. So there is no requirement for a school governing body to have subcommittees, but most school governing bodies that are of a reasonable size do have a subcommittee structure. However, the important information is responsibility for SEND sits with the school governing body, with the board, not with the individual subcommittees and not with the SEND governor. And this is something which often happens, is that SEND governors feel that they are entirely responsible for SEND and the governance of SEND in their setting. And that just isn't the case. It's very clear within the Code of Practice that it is actually the governing board's responsibility. So, you know, sort of if you're feeling under that pressure that it's just you, then, you know, our sort of reflection on that would be go back and say, no, it's not, it's all of us. We're in this together and we need to work through this together. And we all need to understand, what are we doing for our SEND learners? Okay. If we look at SATs, so SATs are single academy trusts. So typically these will be schools that were outstanding schools who had the opportunity to become an academy trust and set themselves up as a SAT. So SATs were set up to be single academy trusts. It's not the case that they are a MAT and they haven't got anyone else joining them yet. A SAT is a different entity. It's a single academy trust. The trust board, sitting in the sort of middle-ish area there, and the trustees who make up the trust board, they are the people who are responsible for the discharge of SEND duties in the SAT. There is an additional tier of governance within a SAT, which is your members, but your members' role is actually defined in the Articles of Association for the SAT, and they typically are about appointing the trustees and then making sure that the trustees are effective in their role. They are not responsible for SEND. It's the trustees' role to make sure that the SEND duties as outlined in the Code of Practice are delivered. Again, there can be a series of committees. They don't have to be. It's entirely up to the school to decide how to make that work happen. Okay. I'm going to move into multi-academy trusts now. So multi-academy trusts, as the name suggests, are trusts where there's more than one academy. It may only be two, but it could be sort of 20, 30, 50. So, you know, and there is a direction of travel at the moment within the Department for Education, which is sort of suggesting that, you know, MAT's sort of a sensible size of MAT is about 15 schools. Coming from a MAT with 5 schools in, have to say, I feel that MAT with 5 schools does work really well. So, you know, there is no perfect size for a multi-academy trust. However, the same message, members are there and they're sitting in that tier above the trust board, very similar role, recruit your trustees and make sure that they are following the vision and values of the trust. And it is the trust board where the responsibility for SEND sits. Again, you may have a series of subcommittees. The only one that is actually sort of required is the Audit and Risk Committee. That's within the current Academy Trust handbook that you must have an Audit and Risk Committee, but the responsibility for SEND will sit there with the trust board. Okay, just to explain that academy trusts have something called a scheme of delegation, and the scheme of delegation is the document which tells the local governing bodies within the multi-academy trust what they are required to do and what the trustees will be doing. So if you are working in a MAT structure, whether at the trustee level or at the local governing body level, it's really important that you understand what are your duties and what are the duties of the trustees. And it should be really clear from the scheme of delegation who's doing what and where those sort of powers and responsibilities sit. And finally, just moving into sixth form college, I'm only going to give it a very light touch, but most FE and sixth form colleges are corporations that are legal entities and they can operate one or more colleges. The direction of travel in the FE sector at the moment is very much towards merger. So there are a number of sort of local colleges, certainly to where we are, where mergers have been taking place. They are exempt charities and they are managed by a board, and the board, much in the same way as we have in the school system, the board is responsible. Again, there may be a series of subcommittees who sit underneath that board. This is just a typical example of what the subcommittees might look like, but the responsibility for the legislative duties for SEND are sitting there with the board. Okay. So again, just like to stop for a moment so you can have a rest from me and have a little think about two questions. So first of all, am I responsible for SEND in my setting? And how responsible am I? Am I responsible as part of the team or am I responsible on my own? And if so, do I understand my role? Okay, so I'm hoping that they're quite simple questions. I think simple is always best. Same format as before. Make your notes, keep them to yourself, share them in the chat. It's entirely up to you, and I'll just give you a couple of minutes to have a think. Okay, for the fast writers, I'll let Nicole start reading through what she's got. And for the sort of slower writers who like to take their time and reflect more, you take your time and make your reflections as you see fit.
Again, people generally, there's definitely a theme of the responsibility sitting with the full board or equivalent, but the SEND governor, the named person, having that responsibility alongside them or leading on that responsibility. But the responsibility for SEND sits with all. A couple of specific answers. Oh, I've got one in all caps, that's exciting. Rebecca says, yeah, as part of the FGB, I know and understand the rest of the FGB are responsible too, and they do challenge and ask questions. It's not all left just to that one person. But I know that can be a challenge for lots of people at different levels of an organisation. If you're the named person, getting other people to take that responsibility and interest in it. I'm going to read the one in caps, but I won't shout because I don't think my throat's up to it, even though I feel like I should. Board of Governors responsibility. This is from Sue. We have a link governor who reports termly to all governors, alongside a Senko report where we can all ask and challenge details. Christine says we have a suggested training requirement for our governors, which includes one item of SEND training for each governor to develop their knowledge. That's from a special school setting. So again, I think that message of shared ownership is clear, but also the people that are saying that they do have that shared ownership clearly have a system for developing that, which I think is important as well.
It sounds like we've got A-star governance on our call, doesn't it? Fantastic. It's always the way, isn't it? People who sign up to a course that's about SEND governance probably already feel very passionate and know a lot about SEND governance. And some of the people that we really want to reach sometimes, don't necessarily see it as something that's for them. So I do hope that, you will be able to take something away from the session that's useful to you. And as I say, over the 3 sort of seminars that we'll be delivering, we are hoping that, we will build on your knowledge and give you some sort of new resources and new stuff to use, as Nicole says, in developing those systems, really. Because if you've got the systems in place, then actually, you can feel very confident in what you're doing. So the next area that we're going into is legal responsibility for SEND. Okay. And I'm going to share a couple of key documents here. The first is the Equality Act, and the second, which bizarrely is on the left-hand side, not the right, is the Code of Practice. So the Equality Act 2010 and schools is a really useful document in terms of sort of actually giving advice for school leaders and governing bodies, along with local authorities, about sort of how the Equality Act should be delivered. And then in addition to that, the Code of Practice is really the Bible for SEND. And it's quite interesting because when we were talking about this with colleagues, the fact that it's a 2015 document is always a bit surprising. You kind of feel that, but we're now in 2021, facing 2022. Should we not have the new version? But there is a SEND review, which is sort of just publishing findings, and hopefully one of the outcomes will be some updates within the SEND Code of Practice, which is a shame because I feel like I know it off by heart now and I'll have to relearn the new one. It is a 292-page document, which is a little bit off-putting for people. So I think one of the reasons that not everyone has read it cover to cover is just that sort of enormity of it. However, there really is a sort of the first chapter, which tells you about the principles and helps you understand sort of where it's all come from, that's quite useful, and there's some useful stuff within there. But also the chapters relevant to the sort of age group in which you're governing are really important. So if you're in the early years, it's chapter 5. If you're in schools, it's chapter 6. And if you're in further education, it's chapter 7. And that really details the information about what it is you need to be doing and what you need to know. Helpfully, I've summarised some of that for you. So hopefully you won't have to read the whole thing, but it isn't a terrible read, is it, Nicole? It's okay.
I personally like it. I know it inside out. I've got to know it.
So these bits are sort of from the code of practice themselves. So the information to maintain nurseries in school, including academies, are about use of best endeavours, publishing details of the SEND provision available through the SEND information reports, cooperating with the local authority in drawing up the local offer, making reasonable adjustments, and informing parents and young people of SEND provision, in addition supporting medical conditions and accountability through Ofsted and the annual report to parents about their children. Within colleges, you'll notice that one of the big differences, there isn't any mention of parents. And for SEND specific colleges, and as I was saying earlier, within the MAP, we have a SPI, a specialist post-16 institution. That can be a bit of a challenge because our young people do actually need advocacy, and their parents are often the people who provide that advocacy. So not exclusively, I mean, many of them are living in supported living and will have carers and support staff who will provide some of that. So it is important to sort of consider that if you're in further education, dependent on how much sort of need a young person has, you know, it is important to liaise with family or with advocates where appropriate. The other thing that's sort of not spelt out within the colleges is also this duty to have the SEND information report. And I think that, you know, that again is something that for schools is almost the sort of summary of everything that's happening in your school around SEND, and can be a really useful document, particularly for governors, because it is your document that you're actually producing. So it should be written with you, if not by you. I think expecting governors to go away and write it on their own feels very unfair, because, you know, they are A, not paid, and B, aren't day-to-day responsible for all of this. However, I think governors taking ownership of that document is very important. Okay. Local authorities have a duty to cooperate, and this is another sort of thing where, you know, sort of, I'm not sure as the CEO of a MAT how much local authorities necessarily do actually communicate with those people responsible for governance in the institutions across their local authority. There are opportunities, absolutely, through various sort of focus groups and things, but it isn't necessarily routine for local authorities to actually come to their partners and really do a detailed analysis of what's going on. Some local authorities, I have to say, do this really well, and others less so. So, you know, it's interesting for you to think about whichever local authority your setting is in, and how much contact you have and the school or the setting has with the local authority around sort of SEND and sort of how you can join up services. So part of the sort of local area SEND reviews is to actually focus in on this and see how joined up is SEND within an area. And not all local authorities have been particularly successful in their SEND review, although positively a number of local authorities that didn't have successful initial SEND reviews have had a successful revisit. And that suggests that the learning that they were able to take from the initial visit has sharpened some practice, has made sure there's better communication. But I think, you know, personally for me, I would love to work more closely with local authorities to better understand the needs of the whole patch and see how schools, colleges, early years providers can actually adapt what they're doing to better meet the needs of their local communities. Sorry, my slides have just frozen a minute. Does the next one come up? Okay. Yeah, I think we're moving again. Sorry about that. So what should you know? So what we've got really is in terms of the code of practice, is the summary of action that mainstream schools need to take. And as I say, I've sort of tailored this to mainstream schools because I feel that will be the bulk of people who are joining us on the call. If that's not your setting, I do apologise if it doesn't feel particularly specific to you, but, you know, sort of if you ask questions, we'll do our best to sort of support you in answering them. Okay. So the relevant legislation, and we're not going to, I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear, I'm not going to be quoting large sections of the relevant legislation. I'm just sharing with you, and it will be in your PowerPoint when you receive it after the event. This is the legislation, the Code of Practice and the Equality Act are based on. Do apologise for anyone who was really looking forward to a full session on the Equality Act. So what schools must do, so these are some things that we've come across before earlier on in the presentation. However, there are some things that we will unpick over the next 3 sessions. For example, best endeavours, I think, is one of those things where what on earth is a best endeavour? So that's something that I would like us to think about. And, sort of if anyone's got examples of where you feel your school or your setting has used best endeavours to meet the needs of a child with SEND, something you've done that's right out of the box, it would be lovely if you could share that in the chat and we can pick it up when we get to that next reflection point. Also making sure that children and young people with SEND are engaged in activity alongside their peers. So the whole inclusive culture of the school is really important here. Actually having a Senko is very important, and designating a teacher, and it is a teacher who will be responsible for coordinating SEND across the school. And there's also a recommendation in the Code of Practice that this teacher should actually be a member of the senior management team. And that's quite important because the ability to have impact is very much sort of linked to status within the school, particularly in a large secondary school, I have to say. It can be very difficult to have your voice heard if you're not actually in quite a senior position. So thinking about who your Senko is and whether or not they are actually sort of in a position to actually discharge the duties and take the responsibility required. There's also a requirement to inform parents where you're making special educational needs. So we're going to talk about the universal, the targeted and the specialist offer. There isn't a requirement to inform people about your universal offer because that's what you have ordinarily available to all of your children. But once you start to identify it as SEND, you're putting that child down on a special needs register and recording the fact that they have a special educational need which requires support, which is additional to or different from that which you're providing for other children. Parents must be informed. And that can be tricky and can be a very difficult conversation with some parents. So, sort of the answer is not to avoid it, though. We do have to make sure that we've actually done that. And then there's the preparation of the SEN information report. And the information report actually sort of has a range of things that we're sharing, and there's key questions, and within the Code of Practice there is the whole list of things that must be in your information report, which I think most schools now, they're fully compliant. It's up on the website, those questions are being answered. But again, it's somewhere for you to have a look to see, is our report on the website and does it really say what we do? Are we happy with it? So what else must schools be doing? So mentioned before that we've got to sort of support the local offer and what's available locally. We've got to promote disability equality. It's one of the protected characteristics, 9 protected characteristics. We need to be focused upon that. Making sure that we make those reasonable adjustments and that we provide the aids and services that are needed for disabled children. However, in terms of how much of those things a school is required to provide is actually part of the concept of what reasonable adjustment is. So very, very small organisations with very little funds are not expected to make the same reasonable adjustments as a large organisation. And for maintained schools, it's sometimes the local authority's duty to make that provision. So being clear on, what is reasonable for your setting and where is it where you start to go for extra help. I think one of the things that we need to be reflective on is duties are anticipatory. So, what that means is you don't wait for the child to arrive with the need and then scrabble around and set up the provision. You imagine the children who would come to your school and you make your school as inclusive as possible. And you don't have to do it on day one. You have an accessibility plan which states that, this is where we are now. This is where we're going to be in 1 year, 3 year, 5 year. And you actually are building up the inclusivity of your school. Schools sort of definitely have this wider duty to prevent discrimination and to promote opportunity. And then also making sure that the arrangements are in place for children with medical conditions, and there's appropriate healthcare support and advice around that. And there's a great document which we'll signpost you to that really helps with that. And then schools are required to deliver on the statutory guidance there around medical conditions. So that's what you must do. And then there's the what should you do. So this is all from the code of practice as well. So the must is, you know, that's your legal responsibility. This is best practice and the stuff that ideally we would love every school to be doing. So appointing a member of the governing body or subcommittee with specific oversight. We've already sort of heard in the chat that several of you have a link governor arrangement, a link Senko governor, but that person is not on their own. They're part of a wider team and they know that, which is great. Making sure that we have sort of the right support, expertise and resources, and we're reviewing how effective that is, and that's very much a part of what governors are doing. They're actually checking that everything is in place and it's working properly, and asking those challenging questions about, you know, so what? You know, you've given me that data, and I think again, Nicole, there was somebody in the chat had reflected on that and said, you know, they have a report and the Senko's report is challenged by all the governors, which is fantastic practice. In terms of the quality of teaching for pupils with SEND, obviously the progress made by pupils is really important. Outcome data as well in terms of, you know, endpoints compared to start points, which will give you those progress measures, and making sure that actually the quality of teaching for pupils with SEND is part of performance management arrangements, not just for the Senko and support staff, but all the staff through the school. So directives around the use of high quality teaching to include learners, you know, that can be part of performance management targets. And then making sure there's the right professional development, because it's obviously not fair to expect people to do stuff if we haven't given them the right training. Next thing we've got is patterns of identification for SEND. So we've had a look at the national patterns, and doing that comparison between school and the national data is a really positive way of actually finding out and testing whether your school's got it about right. So it'd be a really useful exercise to take part in. And actually looking then at quality of teaching and the impact. So if you're looking at the performance of those groups of children under those different areas of need, is there an area of weakness where we could put in more training and support and improve quality of teaching for those types of learner? And making sure that the identification of SEND is part of monitoring and development for all pupils. So it's not something we add on. We don't wait for something to happen. We don't wait for the specialist to come in. We're looking at all of our children with the sort of reflection of they may have SEND if we check that out, rather than, you know, sort of cherry picking the children who definitely have sort of obvious and evident signs. Mainstream schools have to have in place the sort of their arrangements for assessing, and they've got to put those in as part of the local offer. And also schools making sure that parents are actively involved in decision making. So co-production is a big theme within the code of practice, and making sure that children and their parents are involved, not just lip service, but actually sort of really involved in the planning for them. It's so important. Okay. And then making sure that there is a coordination between different services. So particularly where there's a healthcare plan and you've got health involved, you may have social care involved, and making sure this all adds up so the child's lived experience is a positive one and it doesn't feel like they're being done to by lots of different individuals. The National Curriculum Inclusion Statement reinforces this concept of broad and balanced curriculum. So those people facing Ofsted, having sort of sight of the National Curriculum Inclusion Statement is really useful, because it just makes sure that you're online and you're set on target. And this concept of high expectation and deliberate ambition for learners with SEND. And that's something where Ofsted now in the current framework are actually being quite sort of challenging around, is the expectation high enough for these SEND learners? So, you know, for those people who are sort of getting ready for an Ofsted, we will talk about that when we're looking at later sessions. Okay. Next slide, we're just going to have another little reflection on some of those things. So just thinking about some of those must statements from the code of practice. Whilst we're sort of thinking about that, just pick one thing that you think you'd like to take away and follow up in a bit more detail in your setting. And if you've already nailed all the must statements and you're thinking, we're absolutely marvellous, we're doing everything, pick one of the shoulds. And if you've done all that too, just come up with something great that you would like to go into your schools or your setting and have a look at. And I should probably have said, if you're putting things in the chat, don't worry about your spelling, punctuation, grammar. You know, at the end of the day, it's about your ideas, and we are inclusive and accepting of whatever. Nicole, have you got anything you want to?
Yeah, we're just reading. Make QFT the focus at every level. Going to ask for more information on the progress of children with SEN, and if the performance review of staff is analysing the progress of children with SEN. Better communication within the schools themselves and raising awareness. Better accessibility on the websites. Making sure that SEND is at the heart and not marginalised, clarity of roles and sharing info, high expectations for all learners. There's been a couple of requests for good examples of things. I'm just making a note of those for a future session for you, Angela. Yeah, including children alongside the peers. I think that's just about it for now.
Super, thank you. Just a note on the use of quality first teaching, which was QFT that Nicole referred to from the chat. We're tending to go for high quality teaching because the question was, if it's quality first teaching, what do you do next? And I kind of think I empathise with that, because we'd like the quality to last for the whole lesson. I know the quality first in quality first was about do that first before you do anything else, but just in case there's any misunderstanding, high quality teaching, which is something that all mainstream schools sort of have embraced. And one of the things that we've just done recently in our own trust is we looked at Rosenshine's principles, which are very much the mainstream model of educational delivery, and we actually sort of unpicked those for SEND and said, okay, what would that look like then for some of our SEND learners? And then our intention is to do that same training later on in the year, but looking at and how do we adapt those principles for our most able learners? Because I tend to feel if you're thinking hard about the children who've got most need and the children who are most able, and you're challenging and supporting, then actually there's the opportunity to deliver for everything else in the middle as well. So, you know, that's the way we've chosen to do it as a trust. So I'm not holding it up there as a marvellous example of good practice, but it certainly seems to be working for us at trust level. Okay. So just some key concepts that we'd like to share. This is Nicole's slide, which I have shamelessly stolen because I absolutely love it. And what I want to say here really is about your anticipatory duty. So that concept of get it right before the children arrive. And the answer for me is inclusive design. So what you have is three images of children watching I think it's a baseball game. I think we've decided, isn't it? It's very American. But the principle there is that sort of what we tend to do is we think, you know, sort of we'll do the same thing for everybody. And that becomes exclusive because it only works for some people. So the poor child and I'm not good on left and right. So I'm going to have to think really hard. I think he's on the right, the smallest child. Do nod at me if I've got that right. So the child on the right there, he can't see a thing. He's being treated exactly the same as everybody else, but he's excluded because it doesn't work for him. So then when we look to inclusion, we think, well, how do we make sure he can see? And the best way to make him see is to give him yet another box. So we're making it more and more complicated to include this child. And everywhere he goes, he's going to need 2 boxes with him. Whereas if we actually stop at the first stage and think, oh, we're not being inclusive, and think about what's the most inclusive way of doing this, we put up a fence with holes in that everybody can see. And, you know, that simple illustration for me is exactly what special education is all about. It's not about doing fancy, exciting stuff. It's not about sending people off on 14,000 courses. It's about getting people to stop, think about the children they have in front of them, and design a curriculum, a classroom environment, and a way of teaching and learning that includes all learners. And if we get that right, you know, I'll go to my grave happy, because I'll feel like I've really actually made a difference. Okay. The next sort of thing that we want to share with you is around levels of support. So whilst we're identifying children, and one of the things that's really sort of key within the code of practice is the assess, plan, do, review process. So plan, do, review was something that teachers always did. I think the assess bit at the beginning is really, really important, because until you know what children can do, you can't really plan for what you're wanting them to be able to do. So the assess stage is sort of like, where are we now? Baseline assessment, plan what it is you're going to do, actually get on and do it, or implement it, or whatever we want to call it in fancy DFE language now. And then actually that reflection process of sort of, you know, how did it go, the review process. So a really simple concept, 4-part cycle. And through that, children can move between layers of provision. And when I say move between layers of provision, there sometimes seems to be a sense that children need to move upward through this provision. So they start at the universal level, which is what we do for everybody. They then move into specialist provision, targeted provision to address their individual needs. And then if that's not working, we'll move them on into specialist provision. Whereas in actual fact, I feel it should be more of a revolving door where there's opportunity for children to make progress, and that assess, plan, do, review point, they may actually need less support. And one thing that we're very good at, and I have to hold my hand up within the special sector, is very good at putting in support, we're less good at taking it back out again afterwards. And so review should be about, you know, okay, we've been putting all this resource into this learner, he's now making pretty good progress. Do we really still need to have all this support in place? And obviously it's a debate with parents, it's making sure everybody feels comfortable. But, you know, actually the less sort of additionality a learner needs, the more opportunity they have in life. And so if we can try to help remove some of the barriers to learning and actually help and support learners to be successful in the mainstream, that actually will be better for them as a long-term outcome. And that's as a former head of a special school. So, you know, it is really important to get it right in mainstream wherever we can. So we start with the universal provision, as we've mentioned, high quality teaching and learning that's differentiated, and making sure that we are meeting need before need even arises. Then when we move into targeted provision, this is the provision that we need to make that is additional to and different from. So these are the children that go on the SEN register, and if you have the joy of looking through your settings SEN register, it's the SENK pupils. They are your SEN support pupils. But the question to ask is, so what are we doing for those learners that's additional to and different from what we do for every other learner? Because if actually you're not doing anything additional to or different from, why are they on the list? So it's really important to be able to actually tease out what the additional to and different from is for that individual. And then the specialist provision. Specialist provision can be made in mainstream schools. So you could have an EHCP and remain in a mainstream setting and be getting your support, you know, as you're doing all of your mainstream subjects, or you might need to go to specialist provision and access something which is quite different, but again, not necessarily on a one-way ticket, with the option of actually being reintegrated into mainstream, should that be appropriate for you. Okay. So this is another of Nicole's beautiful slides, and this one here is for me sort of for you as governors, to give you some food for thought before we leave you, thinking about where is your school or your setting's universal offer? Because if you draw the universal offer quite small, more children will fall out into the needing the targeted and the specialist support. Whereas if you widen that circle and make your universal offer broad, then you will include more learners in your universal offer. They won't need to be identified as SEN because they will be having their needs met within that universal provision. So as a setting, what is it that you do that's universal, that's ordinarily available to all of your learners? And, you know, is it big enough? And that's a good question, I feel, for governors to be asking. Have we got it right? What's our culture? I promised earlier I'd talk about the 4 broad areas of need and just remind people of what learning difficulties fall under them all. Again, you're going to get this slide, so I'm not going to spend a long time going through it, but just to see the range of difficulties. Again, one of the challenges is, dependent on the type of need of a learner, that will impact on overall outcome. So if you have a cognition and learning need, and that includes, you know, sort of moderate learning difficulties, severe learning difficulties, profound and multiple learning difficulties, your capacity to learn is impacted by your learning difficulty. So if you have a genuine moderate learning difficulty, you're unlikely to get sort of 8 grade 9s at GCSE, because if you can get 8 grade 9s at GCSE, arguably you haven't got a moderate learning difficulty, you're fine. You might need some support to get there, but it's not a moderate learning difficulty. It's more likely to be a specific learning difficulty, which is hampering your ability to access the curriculum. So cognition and learning difficulties are almost a group that we need to pull out and tease out, because the expectations for children with specific learning, for cognition and learning difficulties may be different. But there are definitely learners who can make typical neurotypical progress. So many young people who have communication and interaction needs will be high functioning, and therefore they should be able to make the same progress as their peers, and university should be the planned outcome for them. Many learners with social, emotional and mental health needs, if they've got the right support to support them, there's no reason why they can't make the same performance as their peers. Again, with sensory and physical, if they've got the right adaptations and support in place, and specific learning difficulties. So it's almost worth looking at your data and asking somebody to pull out the learners for the different areas of need and have an opinion about what's progress looking like for those areas of need. And again, asking that question of, do we think this is enough? And the other thing that I'd like you to think about is the use of specialists. So we tend to sort of think about bringing specialists in to work with children at the point of going for an EHCP. And in actual fact, the earlier we involve specialists, the more chance we have of including children. So actually, rather than use your specialist to come and work with one child in order to support them get an EHCP, is it sort of sensible to actually use that specialist to help you design your universal offer and look at how can we include more children? So if you're using an autism specialist teacher, if they come in and help you design the universal offer with you, then you can make all of your rooms, your whole school, autism friendly, communication and interaction friendly. So thinking about how you use specialists. So absolutely, you will need specialist reports and things if a child needs an education healthcare plan, you know, that's a requirement, that's a legal requirement. However, if all of the specialist time is spent on that, then you're not improving the school sort of provision going forward. So it's just again a food for thought. Have a think about how do you use specialists, talk to the school, and, you know, could they be used in a slightly different way? And there's a piece of research I'll direct you to in the notes. And so the final thing that I want us to sort of focus on really is sort of what are we going to be covering next? So we're going to be starting to move into the territory of SEND governance review. And we're going to be sort of walking you through that process a bit and sharing some good practice experience of what Send Review looks like and how it works. And then we will be pulling out, sort of as we go into later sessions, some really strong best practice that we have picked up from across the Lancashire West Yorkshire region that we want to share with you for you to improve the quality of sort of Send in your own settings. Okay. So I'll very quickly do these useful resources slides and then see if there's any more questions, if that's okay. So Nason Whole School Send produce a vast array of fantastic resources. There's some wonderful webinars on there. In order to access them, most things are free. There's a small charge for some things, but most things are free. The things on the sheet there are all free. But if you sign up to the Gateway, could I please ask, and if you've already signed up to the Gateway, that's wonderful. But if you didn't click on the I'd like to sign up to the Nason newsletter, could you go back in and edit your preferences and tick the box that says I'd like to sign up to the newsletter? Because apparently when our effectiveness is measured, the measurement is how many people are signed up to the newsletter. And I've never mentioned this to people before because I didn't realise. So if you could do me a massive favour, if you've got anything out of today at all, can you please check your preferences and make sure you sign up to the newsletter? You can always unsubscribe if you need to at a later date, but it would be really helpful. And there's fantastic stuff in the newsletter to keep you up to date. So it is a really useful way of knowing about what's coming out of Nason Whole School Send. And a couple of things there just to pull out. There's some condition specific videos which can be really useful. I mean, initially the contract was to develop them for newly qualified teachers and as part of the sort of ITT, initial teacher training program, but they are really good little snapshots. They're sort of, I think, 10-15 minutes long, and they tell you about different conditions. So if you've got a child who has come to the school with a need that teachers and staff haven't come across before, it can just give you that little bit of information that can be really helpful. And the Senko Induction Pack, marvellous resource, not just for Senkos. I mean, it says Induction Pack, but it suggests it's just for people who are new, but it's actually great for anybody. And as governors, you can actually go on the Gateway and actually download that and use that to sort of, I wouldn't say interrogate your Senko, what's a better word? You know, sort of have a sort of a critical friendship chat with your Senko. But Senkos are under a huge amount of pressure. COVID means all school staff are under massive pressure, and I see that in my own trust. So, you know, we'll all look after each other and think about people's mental health and well-being at these difficult times. But, you know, yourselves as well, your volunteers, I'm sure many of you work very hard doing other things, you know, outside your governance role. So we really appreciate you joining us this evening. We do hope you'll come back to the follow-up sessions when we will delve more deeply into sort of how you can sort of improve Send governance in your own setting. Nicole, is there anything in the chat?
There's one question in the Q&A about where this info is available to download. If that means the PowerPoint slides, then that will be sent out tomorrow, but also it will be available on the Send Gateway eventually at some point. I think, I hope I haven't missed anything in the chat, just from what I've seen. Just bear with me a second. There was one question from, I think it's Teresa, saying, how do you involve specialists when often they can only deal with children with an EHCP? Okay, so in terms of specialists, you've obviously got sort of speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, you sort of your range of professional roles. The other group of people who can be really useful for mainstream schools are specialist teachers. Local authorities tend to have a group of specialist teachers who schools, but also, you know, don't be afraid to approach your local special school, because special schools train a lot of their teachers postgraduate. So across the trust, we've got postgraduate specialists, probably about 45 teachers with a whole range of different skills. And, you know, the one thing we love to do is get them out into mainstream, because it's really good for their CPD to remind themselves of what mainstream schools look like. So, you know, if you're struggling to get hold of specialists to support you, then, you know, a good place to go
is the local special school.
No other specific questions that I can see.
Yeah.
I mean, no specific questions, but just to add to what you said, as a mainstream Senko, I've had that exact problem trying to get specialist support at the universal and even additional and different SEND support K-coded stage is really, really hard. Where you build a relationship with your local authority and they can understand why and how that work can be proactive and preventative and actually take the pressure off their workload. I found that actually EdPsych and speech and language therapy have been keen to be involved, but it's about building that relationship first. We've brought some provision in-house because of the challenges that we've faced. But interestingly, I was just speaking to one of our new schools in Liverpool, Dixon schools in Liverpool, and they've done exactly what you said, Angela. They've reached out to a local special school who've come in and looked at their provision and advised, and their advice were very much at the universal level as well, supporting them to develop whole school systems. So even though you might think that asking a special school to advise would result in kind of more additional and different and leaning more towards the specialist end, that is the opposite of what happened. They have really clear inclusive systems for all the children at a whole school level, and there are definitely things that can be transferred to mainstream.
And I think, you know, sort of cross-sector working, support across transition, understanding what worked for young people within their primary school setting, for the secondary school, you know, these things can all help young people to be successful at that universal level. So, you know, that, as I say, in future sessions, we will drill a lot more into the detail of how to do the SEND governance review and, you know, how to sort of capture the best practice that's happening in your school, and also share, as I say, the stuff that we've managed to pick up across the region. But thank you so much for joining us. Really conscious of your time on a Thursday night, you know, hopefully you have found something useful in the session. Thank you.